On a quiet banking day in December 2006, a modest electronic transfer left the British Treasury and crossed the Atlantic. No crowds gathered, no speeches were given. There were no flags, no parades, no grainy newsreels. On the surface, it was just another line in a spreadsheet, another routine settlement between two governments. But that payment marked the end of a 60-year obligation. It was the final installment on a debt that had begun not with a flourish of triumph, but in the darkest hour of Britain's survival. 60 years after the guns had fallen silent, Britain was still paying for its victory in the Second World War. The empire that once financed continental wars, that insured ships in every ocean, that set the terms of global credit from the City of London, had spent 2 generations making interest payments to its former colony. On paper, the story is simple: a loan taken in crisis, repaid over time. In reality, it is something deeper and more unsettling. It is the financial signature on the end of an empire. The question is not who won the war. That is easy to answer. Hitler lost, Japan surrendered, the Allies prevailed. The question that refuses to vanish is different. How does a nation that wins a world war end up dependent on the goodwill of its ally to feed itself, to import raw materials, to keep the lights on? How does the self-proclaimed banker of the world end up pawning its assets one by one to the United States Treasury? To answer that, we have to go back to the winter when the outcome was anything but certain. In December 1940, Britain stood on the edge of an abyss. In the skies over southern England, the Battle of Britain had been fought and narrowly won, but the victory was fragile. At night, the Luftwaffe bombed cities into flame. London burned street by street. Coventry's cathedral lay in ruins. Liverpool's docks glowed red under falling incendiaries. Blast waves shattered glass and sleep alike. On the map, the British Empire still covered a quarter of the globe. Crimson ink stretched from the Caribbean to India, from Africa to the Pacific. It looked immense, unshakable, timeless. But the map lied. Beneath Whitehall, in rooms carved out of concrete and steel, the men responsible for steering that empire were staring at ledgers, not maps. And the numbers were terrifying. The empire was not just bleeding soldiers and ships. It was bleeding to death financially. In the underground cabinet war rooms, under low ceilings and stale air, Winston Churchill sat at a desk illuminated by a single lamp. Above him, bombs fell. Around him, telephones rang with updates from every front. But the task in front of him was not a stirring broadcast to the British people. It was not a call to fight on the beaches or in the fields. It was a letter. The letter was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Roosevelt presided over the richest neutral nation on earth, a country untouched by bombing raids, shielded by oceans, and governed by a public that wanted no part in another European bloodbath. Churchill was a master of language. He knew how to hurl words like artillery. But this letter demanded something different. Not defiance, not poetry. Humility. Almost humiliation. He had to tell the leader of the rising American century that the British Empire, the workshop of the world, the power that had defeated Napoleon, was running out of money. The letter was long and precise. It laid out the strategic reality. German U-boats slaughtering merchant convoys in the Atlantic. Destroyers and aircraft needed in numbers, the British shipyards could not match factories working day and night, yet falling behind the pace of total war. The British would fight on the beaches and in the streets, Churchill insisted. They would never surrender. But rifles, tanks, and aircraft engines did not come from sheer willpower. They came from American assembly lines, and those machines only moved in one direction in peacetime law, in exchange for cash. Here lay the brutal simplicity of the problem. When the war began in September 1939, Britain had been a financial giant. It possessed enormous gold reserves. British investors owned railways in South America, mines in Africa, industries inside the United States itself. Insurance, shipping, banking. London was the nervous system of global commerce, yet the war Hitler had unleashed was not a 19th century campaign. It was a war of industry, a war of steel, oil, aluminium, rubber. It consumed raw materials and machines at a rate no treasury model had fully imagined. Britain, an island nation, imported almost everything: food, fuel, metals, even timber. With Europe under Nazi control, the traditional trading routes were severed. If Britain wanted to keep fighting, it had to look west, across the Atlantic, to the one country that could still supply what it needed. But there was a catch. The United States was neutral. It remembered the trenches of 1917. It remembered the corpses and the war debts that had followed. Congress had erected legal walls called Neutrality Acts. Buried within them was a seemingly straightforward clause: cash and carry. If a country at war wanted American weapons, it could buy them, but only if it paid in cash and carried the goods away on its own ships. No loans, no credit, no promises, gold on the barrel, or nothing at all. For the first year of the war, Britain complied. The Treasury emptied itself to meet American invoices. In a secret high-risk operation known as Operation Fish, The British state loaded its gold reserves in negotiable securities bonds, shares portable wealth onto warships and liners, and sent them across U-boat-infested waters to the vaults of North America. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history, an entire financial inheritance sent into exile to pay for the right to keep fighting. But even that had limits. By late 1940, the gold was nearly gone. The liquid assets were exhausted. On the desks of the British Purchasing Commission in Washington, contracts for aircraft and tanks sat unsigned because London could no longer guarantee payment in dollars. This is the moment in which Churchill's letter was written. The bombs, the blackouts, the burning cities behind all of them lay a quieter threat. Without dollars, the factories in Detroit and Buffalo would slow and then stop the flow of weapons to Britain. Without those weapons, the island fortress would not hold. Churchill understood the stakes. If Britain fell, the war would not end. The front line would simply move, first to the Atlantic, then to the Americas. But Roosevelt faced a different battlefield, domestic politics. He could not openly join the war. He could not openly give money to a foreign empire. The law forbade it. The voters opposed it. He needed a mechanism that looked like a business arrangement, not a bailout. He needed to persuade American taxpayers that helping Britain was not charity, but prudence. From this problem, the idea of Lend-Lease would emerge. Roosevelt would present it to the public as a simple, almost neighborly arrangement. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your garden hose. He uses it, returns it, and no one haggles over the price while the flames rise. It was a comforting metaphor, human, generous, reasonable. But metaphors are cheap. The reality was not a conversation between neighbors over a garden fence. It was a negotiation held in government offices and treasury corridors between a creditor with the printing presses and a debtor with no alternatives. It would not unfold as a partnership of equals. It would unfold as something much colder, the restructuring of a distressed asset on a continental scale. Because before the United States would lend, it would audit. Before it would hand over weapons on credit, it would ask a simple, ruthless question. Had Britain truly exhausted everything it owned? That question, and the answer extracted to satisfy it, would change the balance of power in the 20th century. It would turn victory into a long invoice. It would move the center of global finance from the City of London to the United States. The war would be decided by battles and bombs. But the world that followed would be decided by the terms of the bill. The letter Churchill wrote in that underground room did more than plead for help. It opened the books of an empire. They knew the company was worth well over $100 million in normal times, perhaps more. They knew that if they were forced to sell it quickly during a war, with every potential buyer aware of their desperation, the price would collapse. They knew that selling it would not just remove a profitable asset, it would surrender a foothold in American industry that had taken decades to build. They resisted. They argued that such a sale would be financial self-harm. They explained again that they were fighting not just one war but two, the physical struggle against Germany and the economic struggle to avoid emerging from the war as a hollowed-out economy. Morgenthau was unmoved. His position was simply that of a creditor in a foreclosure. The distressed party does not get to choose which asset goes first, and he had an additional piece of leverage. While Churchill and Roosevelt spoke the language of partnership in their correspondence, the Lend-Lease bill still had to survive Congress. Morgenthau knew he could walk into hearings and point to tangible British sacrifices, or he could walk in empty-handed and watch the bill die under attack. So he presented the British with a choice that was not a choice. Sell American viscose, or the political support for Lend-Lease might evaporate. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would have no weapons, no food, no fuel. On Sunday, 15th of March 1941, the British government acted. Under emergency war powers, it seized control of American viscose from its British owners. There was no negotiation. Courts and shareholders were bypassed. The company was taken as if it were a weapon of war, rather than a manufacturer of synthetic textiles. The sale that followed was handled by American bankers who understood, to the last dollar, how weak the British position was. They negotiated as one negotiates with a debtor who cannot walk away. The final price? Roughly $54 million, barely half of what the company was worth. For Courtaulds, the British company that had built American viscose, the blow was doubled. The British government had to compensate it in pounds back home, adding to domestic debt. Meanwhile, the dollars from the forced sale did not even remain in British hands. They went straight to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons already on order. From London's perspective, it was daylight robbery concealed within legal language. From Washington's perspective, it was evidence, proof that Britain was bleeding real assets, proof that Lend-Lease was not a free ride. But the lesson was larger than one factory. For the British elite, American viscose was the moment of revelation. It showed them what the special relationship would mean in practical terms. They were not co-architects of a shared strategy. They were clients, paying with whatever collateral they could offer. And the collateral was not limited to factories and bonds. It included geography. While Morgenthau's officials picked over securities and share registers, another set of negotiations unfolded over maps rather than balance sheets. Britain needed destroyers, fast. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic at a rate that threatened to sever the supply line to North America. Grain, oil, munitions, all of it traveled in convoys, and without sufficient escort vessels, the convoys were turning into floating graveyards. In American naval yards, dozens of old destroyers from the First World War sat in reserve. They were outdated, worn, not suitable for the modern U.S. Navy. But to Britain they were lifelines. Churchill begged for them. Roosevelt agreed, but again, there would be no gifts. The transaction was framed not as charity, but as a trade. 50 aging destroyers in exchange for something Britain still possessed in abundance, strategic real estate. The deal that followed was simple in wording, vast in consequence. In return for those rusting ships, the United States received 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases across the Western Hemisphere, Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, and more. On paper, it was an exchange of value, old hardware for useful territory. In practice, it was a signal that the center of global power was shifting. Britain, the old maritime hegemon, was conceding to Washington the right to build and operate bases on British soil. Bases that would project American power deep into the Atlantic and the Caribbean for a century. The terms were not measured in election cycles. They were measured in human lifetimes. This was what desperation looked like on an imperial scale, a country trading long-term strategic assets for short-term survival, selling factories to pay for bullets, leasing bases to acquire obsolete ships, opening its financial records to a foreign treasury to qualify for aid. Publicly, the language remained noble. Leaders spoke of partnership, of democracy's arsenal of common struggle against tyranny. Privately, in memos and minutes, the tone was colder. Lend-Lease would keep Britain alive, but it would do so on conditions written in Washington, conditions that would reshape the world long after the bombing stopped. By the time the Lend-Lease bill finally passed and Roosevelt signed it into law in March 1941, much of Britain's liquid wealth had already been stripped away. The gold was gone. Major American industrial assets were sold. Bases had been leased. The empire's financial armor was cracked open. Lend-Lease would now flow. Tanks, planes, oil, food, ammunition. It would keep Britain from starvation and surrender. On the surface, it looked like salvation, and in one sense, it was. Without it, the Nazi blockade might well have strangled the island. But even in its enabling legislation, buried in clauses drafted by patient lawyers, the future was being written. Somewhere beneath the stirring speeches and reassuring metaphors, there was a paragraph that Britain would come to regret. A short article, written in dense diplomatic prose, that made a simple demand. When the war was over, Britain would dismantle the economic walls that still protected its empire from American competition. The empire had begun the war as a customer. Under Lend-Lease, it became collateral. Under that little clause, it would become something else entirely, a market. The weapons would be delivered, the invoices would be postponed, but nothing, in the end, would be free. Article 7 did not look like a weapon. It looked like paperwork. In the text of the Lend-Lease agreements, surrounded by assurances and diplomatic courtesies, it appeared as a small, technical paragraph. It did not mention tanks or aircraft. It did not discuss convoys or bombing raids. Instead, it spoke of trade barriers, tariffs, and discrimination in international commerce. To most readers, it would have seemed harmless. To the British officials who understood the machinery of their empire, it was a blade pressed quietly against the throat of their future. For decades, the British Empire had been held together not only by flags and garrisons, but by a system called Imperial preference. It was an economic wall built out of tariffs and trade agreements that favored commerce within the empire. A textile mill in Lancashire could sell cloth more cheaply in India or Australia than an American competitor because imperial tariffs made non-British goods more expensive. Wheat from Canada, wool from Australia, rubber from Malaya, all flowed through imperial channels under terms that privileged British industry. It was not a free market. It was a closed loop deliberately designed to keep British factories busy and British ships moving, even in the face of more efficient American production. Article 7 demanded that, after the war, the system be dismantled. In exchange for wartime aid, Britain agreed that it would work toward the elimination of preferential tariffs within its empire. In plain terms, Britain accepted that the empire's markets would be open to American goods. The British negotiators fought this clause. They understood exactly what it meant. Without the protective wall of imperial preference, British manufacturers would face head-on competition from American companies that had larger domestic markets, newer factories, and access to oceans of capital. British exports would struggle. Industries that had depended on captive imperial markets would wither. But the arguments collided with reality. German bombers still crossed the Channel. U-boats still stalked the convoys. The treasury was empty. There were no good options, only degrees of disaster. Under that pressure, Article 7 was accepted. The European War would still take years to win, but the economic conditions for the post-war order had already been signed into existence in a clause that most civilians would never hear about. Even as these terms were fixed on paper, the deeper shift was already underway in steel and smoke. As the United States expanded its role from arms supplier to full combatant after Pearl Harbor, American industry entered a phase of acceleration without historical precedent. Factories that had once produced cars now produced tanks and trucks by the tens of thousands. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in days rather than months. Aircraft plants filled the skies with bombers and fighters, powered by cheap oil and abundant steel. Government contracts poured into every sector. The war was a feast of demand. And yet, unlike Britain, the United States remained physically untouched by bombing. Its cities did not burn. Its ports were not blockaded. Its workers went home at night to houses with lights on and shops with goods on their shelves. Britain's factories, by contrast, became engines dedicated almost entirely to survival. Export industries were gutted or reconfigured to produce munitions. Civilian production was slashed. What little capacity remained for consumer goods was further constrained by rationing. The country stopped earning foreign currency from exports and became dependent on American credits to bridge the gap between what it needed to import and what it could afford. Every month that the war continued, this imbalance grew. The United States was not just arming the Allies. It was quietly taking over the markets they had abandoned. While British factories turned out Spitfires and artillery shells, American factories turned out bombers and refrigerators, radios and automobiles, destined for a world in which British firms could no longer compete. The ledger was shifting. Gold flowed west. Industrial capacity flowed west. Market share flowed west. When the guns finally fell silent, the bills would not. The silence came, officially, on a summer day in 1945. In Europe, victory had already been declared. In Asia, after firebombing and atomic blasts, Japan surrendered. On August 15th, the news raced along telegraph lines and wires, flashed onto screens and posters. Crowds surged into the streets of London. Bonfires lit up dimmed squares. People danced, cried, embraced. The empire had endured 6 years of war. It had buried its dead, endured its rationing, watched its cities smolder, and it had not fallen. It felt for one brief moment like a clean victory. Across the Atlantic, the mood was different. There were celebrations, of course, but in Washington, the machinery of government did not pause. War had been a context. Peace was a transition. Files that had waited years for a signature came back to the top of the pile. Among them were the documents that governed Lend-Lease. On paper, Lend-Lease was an emergency measure tied to the defense of the United States and its allies. When that emergency ended, so did the legal basis for the program. In August 1945, just days after Japan's surrender, President Harry Truman signed an order terminating Lend-Lease with immediate effect. The instructions were brutally simple. Existing contracts were to be canceled. No new aid was to be authorized. Cargoes in transit that had not yet been delivered were no longer covered. In the Atlantic Ocean, Liberty ships loaded with wheat, meat, machinery, and tools found their orders changed mid-voyage. Instead of sailing on to Liverpool or Glasgow, some were ordered to turn back. Food and equipment that Britain had been counting on to bridge the gap between wartime scarcity and peacetime reconstruction would never arrive. In London, the shock was profound. Officials in Whitehall had assumed there would be a tapering off period, a gradual reduction in aid as economies adjusted from war production to civilian demand. Instead, the financial oxygen was cut off in a single bureaucratic stroke. John Maynard Keynes looked at the numbers and saw the precipice. Throughout the war, Britain had imported roughly half of its food and vast quantities of raw material, coal, timber, metals, oil, without paying immediately in hard currency. Lend-Lease had covered the gap. Now, overnight, that bridge was gone. The war had left Britain with bombed factories, battered infrastructure, and a population that had endured years of rationing. It had not left it with the dollar reserves needed to feed the population in peacetime while rebuilding. Keynes understood what the end of Lend-Lease really meant. Without a new source of financing, the country faced a financial Dunkirk, a retreat, not from beaches, but from solvency itself. Default was not an abstraction. It would mean cutting imports of food and raw materials to the bone. It would mean deeper rationing in peace than had been endured in war. It would mean mass unemployment as factories ran out of inputs. It would mean social unrest in a country that had just sacrificed everything for victory. There was only one place left to turn, the same place that now held the world's gold and controlled the only currency everyone trusted. Britain had to go back to Washington, not as a co-strategist in war, but as a supplicant in peace. In September 1945, Keynes, ill, exhausted, his heart weakened by years of strain, boarded a ship for the United States. He went not as a triumphant architect of post-war order, but as an envoy for a government with empty pockets. He believed he had a moral argument that no reasonable ally could ignore. Britain had entered the war in 1939 when the United States still watched from a distance. It had fought alone for 2 years, taking casualties, burning through its reserves, holding the line against an enemy that threatened not just its empire, but the balance of power in the world. It had sacrificed its overseas investments, its gold, its comfort. In Keynes' view, the United States owed Britain not charity, but settlement. He proposed what he called justice, a grant of approximately $6 billion, not as a gift in the sentimental sense, but as a retroactive payment for services rendered, a recognition that Britain had bought time for America's eventual entry into the war. He expected debate. He did not expect the answer he received. The atmosphere in Washington had changed. The enemy was defeated. The American public was weary of foreign entanglements. In Congress, the new Labour government in London, with its plans for nationalization and welfare, was regarded with suspicion. Why should American taxpayers, it was asked, fund a social experiment abroad when they had their own veterans to house and employ? Keynes sat across from American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, and made his case. Vinson listened, then responded in the language of contracts rather than gratitude. There would be no grant. There would be no free transfer of wealth. If Britain wanted dollars, it would receive them in the form familiar to bankers throughout history. A loan, on commercial terms, with interest. The sum on offer, $3.75 billion, was lower than Keynes had judged necessary, but still large enough to keep Britain from immediate collapse. The problem lay not only in the amount, but in the conditions attached. The most dangerous of those conditions appeared, again, as technical language on paper. Within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain would make the pound sterling fully convertible. That is, any holder of pounds anywhere in the world would be entitled to exchange them for US dollars at a fixed rate. During the war, Britain had managed its scarcity of dollars by keeping the sterling area closed. Colonies and allied countries were paid in pounds, but were not free to convert those pounds into American currency. This forced them to buy British goods and limited the drain of dollars from London's reserves. Sterling convertibility would blow that system open. The moment it was introduced, every government, bank, and corporation holding pounds would be free to cash them in for dollars. And, given the choice between a currency issued by a bombed, indebted nation and one backed by the industrial colossus of the United States, the preference was obvious. Keynes grasped the implications instantly. Convertibility, imposed before Britain had rebuilt its export industries or accumulated reserves, would trigger a run on the pound. The American loan would not fund reconstruction over years. It would be consumed in weeks as holders of sterling rushed to convert. He argued, pleaded, and warned. He explained that such a condition would cripple Britain, and with it, a key ally in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. He pointed out that a shattered British economy would not be a bulwark of stability, but a source of weakness in the Western alliance. But again, the leverage was one-sided. The United States knew Britain had nowhere else to go. In the end, the British government, facing the specter of starvation and political collapse, agreed. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes returned home, and within months, his heart gave out. He died that spring, leaving behind a country tied to a financial timetable he had fought to prevent. Reality arrived sharply. The winter of 1947 was among the coldest in living memory. Snowstorms buried roads and rail lines. Coal froze in stockpiles, unreachable or unusable. Power stations faltered. Factories went dark. Households lit candles and huddled in coats inside their own homes. In this frozen landscape, the promise of peace felt distant. Bread, never rationed even during the worst years of submarine warfare, was now rationed in peacetime. And then, on 15th of July 1947, the key condition of the American loan came into force. The pound was made convertible. Foreign holders of sterling could present their balances and demand payment in dollars. The response was exactly what Keynes had predicted. Countries across the sterling area, from India to Egypt, had accumulated pounds during the war. They had been forced buyers of British goods. Now, with a single policy change, they saw a chance to exchange those constrained balances for the universally accepted currency of the new age. The flood began. Sterling poured out of Britain's accounts and dollars poured out in return. The reserves that were supposed to support years of recovery began to vanish. In a single month, hundreds of millions of dollars left the British treasury. Each day's figures were worse than the last. By August, the drain was unsustainable. Britain was, once again, bleeding to death financially. After just 5 weeks, the government slammed the window shut and suspended convertibility. They went back to Washington and admitted failure. The mechanism demanded as proof of modernity, and openness had instead revealed raw weakness. The humiliation was not just technical, it was geopolitical. A country that had strutted across the 19th century world as its banker now found itself unable to defend its own currency. The pound, once the central pivot of world finance, now wobbled under the weight of obligations it could not meet. The consequences were immediate. In February of that same year, before convertibility even began, Britain had already sent a quiet telegram to the United States, announcing another retreat. For generations, Britain had acted as the guarantor of Greece and Turkey against Russian pressure. Maintaining that role required money, subsidies, military aid, a naval presence. The telegram admitted what the budget figures had already made clear. Britain could no longer afford it. If the United States wanted to contain Soviet influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, it would have to pay the bill itself. From that telegram emerged the Truman Doctrine, the formal declaration that the United States would assume responsibility for defending the free world against communism. The baton had been passed, not at a ceremonial conference, but through a message born of insolvency. In 1949, the pressure forced another acknowledgement of decline. The pound, which before the war had stood at $486, was devalued to $280. Overnight, the international purchasing power of British incomes fell by roughly 30%. Imported goods became more expensive. Travel, investment, and trade all reflected the diminished status. A century earlier, such a collapse in a major power's currency might have signaled revolution or fragmentation. In the mid-20th century, it signaled something subtler, the consolidation of a new monetary order centered on the dollar. The British public did not experience these events as abstract shifts in reserve currencies. They experienced them as cues, shortages, and a stubborn sense that the promised fruits of victory were missing. They had endured 6 years of war, expecting, at the end of it, a release, a return to stability, perhaps even prosperity. Instead, they encountered years of austerity under a government that, for all its ambition to build a welfare state, had to operate within the constraints of external debt and dollar scarcity. The empire itself began to loosen. Some colonies moved steadily toward independence. Others negotiated new terms of association. Behind every political decision lurked an economic reality. The imperial center no longer commanded the surplus it once had. It could not promise investment, subsidized markets, or endless military cover. Yet the bill for survival did not end with devaluation, or with the end of rationing, or even with the symbolic decline of imperial prestige during crises like Suez. The Anglo-American Loan, taken in 1946, was long dated. Its term stretched across decades, its interest quietly accruing whether British politics swung left or right. Through the boom of the 1950s, as Europe rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, through the inflation and industrial strife of the 1970s, through the privatizations and financial deregulation of the 1980s, through the globalization of the 1990s, one small but persistent line remained in the budget: payments to the United States and Canada on the loans that had stabilized Britain at the end of the war. The final installment was made on 29 December 2006. No bands played, no leaders issued grand statements. It was a transaction between treasuries, a sum of money transferred, a debt officially extinguished. Most citizens did not notice, but that payment closed a circle that had begun in the winter of 1940, when Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, and admitted that the empire could no longer fund its own defense. The story that unfolded between those two dates is often told as one of moral clarity, a small island standing firm against tyranny, a noble alliance, a shared victory. Those elements are real, but they sit atop another, less comfortable story written in balance sheets, loan agreements, and trade clauses. In that story, Britain did win the war against Nazi Germany. It also lost its financial independence. It sold factories, shipping, and bases at distressed prices. It signed away its privileged access to its own imperial markets. It borrowed to eat, and in doing so, accepted constraints that would shape its destiny for generations. Germany lost the war and was shattered, only to be rebuilt under an American-designed system. Britain won the war and remained standing, only to discover that the price of standing was to lean increasingly on the same power that now held its debts. The only major player whose economy emerged larger, richer, and structurally dominant was the United States. Its industrial base was intact. Its currency became the standard. Its treasury held the IOUs. Wars in the modern age are often presented as contests of courage and will, but courage and will do not pay for steel, oil, or food. Those are bought with credit, and credit is extended on terms. The Second World War did not end with unconditional surrender alone. It ended with conditional solvency. When Churchill picked up his pen in that underground room in 1940, he was making more than a request. He was entering into an arrangement in which Britain would trade its accumulated wealth, its assets, and finally its privileged position in the world for the means to stay alive long enough to defeat Hitler. It was a decision that had to be made. No government in his position could have chosen otherwise. But necessity does not cancel consequence. The empire did not simply fall, toppled by nationalist movements or defeated on battlefields. Piece by piece, it was converted into payments, factories sold, bases leased, tariffs surrendered, currencies devalued, to settle the account for a war that could not be fought on cash terms alone. The victory that filled the streets with joy in 1945 carried a quiet invoice that would not be fully paid for another 60 years. In the textbooks, wars have winners and losers. In the ledgers, they have debtors and creditors. Britain won the war. The United States wrote the bill.